matter of trust, songs in the key of faith. We're thinking about Psalms of Trust today. I love to start my day with scripture and some spiritual reading, but actually sort of the first thing I do is stretch a little bit. I have to tell you, it's not always in this kind of a setting, that I get to start my day. It actually looks like this right outside my window. and I let's see, how's it go? It's sort of a stretch and pray little maneuver, but I lift my eyes up to the mountains from whence cometh my help. My help comes in the name of the Lord. There's a psalm that I like to sing. I think it's Psalm 25. That is a psalm of trust as well. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. To only you, O Lord, I wait for your return. It's a beautiful way for me to start today because I know that I need something to happen to me every day and sometimes many times during the day, and that is to have my spirit renewed and to have some of the attitudes and thoughts and behaviors of my life just cleansed and brought to a sense of being filled with the Spirit. So the experience of the Psalms of Trust are very much that kind of experience. Many of you know that we've got our grandson Jonah living with us for now, as his mom Perla and dad Reed are actively looking for a house. So sooner than later he'll be moving out. But we're taking advantage of our time with him to make sure that he gets his day started in the right way. So I managed to sneak that picture. I was sitting there having breakfast with him, and I thought, there's no way I'll be able to run upstairs, get my phone, turn it on, and then get back, and he'll still be reading the comics. He doesn't really read very much. But by golly, he was still there, and I snuck in on him about a month ago when the lilacs were blooming. And thinking about starting our day and having God's trust as something that's in our lives. Well, we began this series 2 weeks ago, and it was Psalm 1 where we began and said that happy are those, or blessed are those, who love the word of the Lord, who meditate on it day and night. That sense of being close to the word of the Lord throughout our life and where we go. We were thinking with some of our families yesterday that are exploring new membership. It was an orientation for new members, and we said we know how it is in our lives. We kind of live in a split where we've got our lives out there in the world, and they're really busy, and there's so much going on, and we live that world out there, and then sometimes we go to church. And that's sort of where our religious self can be expressed. But of course, God wants us to be able to put all of this together and to be able to pay attention out there to how God is in everything. And that's really hard. But these Psalms get at that idea when it says, happy are those that love the Word and meditate on it day and night. So that's how we began. But no sooner did we kind of accept that the well-ordered life is tuned by the Word of God than we observed that stuff happens. That was last Sunday, right? Stuff happens not just to non-religious people, but to everybody. And being religious doesn't mean that stuff doesn't happen. It means that we have resources in our life when stuff happens. And specifically, a lot of those resources were the 67 Psalms we mentioned last Sunday. 67 of the 150 Psalms that are devoted to what's called lament, crying out to God when we're upset, when we're afraid, when we're angry, when we're worried, when we even feel hatred. Things that we think religious people probably shouldn't feel, right there in the Bible, in the Psalms, are brought to God in prayer. And those resources are what God offers us when stuff happens. So that brings us to today, and as we deal with the reality of stuff in our prayer and in God, we are brought to a place of trust. And this is what happens in our psalm today, Psalm 27, praise, trust into being. If you're filling out your little bulletin main points, that's the first one. Psalm 27, praise, trust into being. That's what I'm doing in the morning when I get up and I stretch and I pray, because I'm not always feeling so, chipper in the morning. And I know I need to just kind of stretch and say, to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. In only you, Lord, I wait for your return. And the deep breath and the stretching is a refreshment that I need in my soul. I need trust to be prayed into my being. It's beautiful when you begin to look at the Psalms through the lens of trust, and how so many of them lead us in trusting. Psalm 27 is a specific example. Let's recite this together. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And when we begin to see trust in the Psalms, we recognize many Psalms that pick up this same theme in song and prayer. Now, as you read these samples, realize that the Psalms that were written recognize that God's creation isn't safe. Stuff happens. My wife and I were looking at the paper, it must have been yesterday, and just grieving over that horrible robbery in about 30 blocks from our house of that refugee family from Burma who came to this country to be safe after years in the refugee camp, only to be devastated by a violent crime. This world is not safe. And these Psalms face that reality, the reality that there is danger. And it was a psalm of trust that the Catholic priest Martin Luther was inspired by during the Reformation, when he was proposing that the church, why would this need to be such a radical thought? That churches and institutions, just like individuals, have to constantly be made new. We've got to constantly be sharpened, and how we decay and decline. And yet, when that Catholic priest proposed reforms, his very life was in grave danger, and he turned to the Psalms, a psalm of trust in Psalm 46, and it was that psalm that inspired his writing of that most famous hymn, Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress, is our God, a very present help in a time of trouble. These psalms of trust pray our lives into the presence of God in the reality of danger. It was a psalm of trust that was hidden in Jesus' life, that he recited as his last words, among his final words, were a psalm of trust. Into your hand, O Lord, I commend my spirit, for you alone are my rock and my Redeemer. Jesus recited a psalm of trust in his last words, among his last words on the cross. Well, I mentioned that next week's our final Psalm series sermon. Then we're going to begin 4 weeks in a series called Proverbia, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living. And we're going to look at Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and maybe a little Song of Solomon. All of these portions of the Bible called wisdom for life that are closely related to the Psalms. And there happens to be a proverb that we'll look a little bit at, but it's been personally very meaningful to me because it sounds just like a psalm of trust. How many times I have recited these words when I'm feeling under siege. Trust in the Lord with your whole heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and God will make straight your path. When has trusting in God been important for you? Only you can really answer that question, and maybe it will have a present application to what you're facing in your life. And as you pray and present that need to God, trust is prayed into your being to turn your life over to God. I can't answer the question for each individual, but I've been hearing from people over the last number of months these kinds of things, knowing that these are occasions where trust is important when a family is moving to a new city and uprooting their lives from one place to an unknown place. When a loved one is leaving home. It was just 2 weeks ago that we wrapped our high school graduates in the quilts that our quilters made and wrapped them in the love of the congregation that has surrounded them all their growing years and are sending them off. But many of us know that to step out into the world on your own, as excited as you might be and as much as you know it's time, part of you is like, wow, this is really for real. I'm going out into the world on my own. And it's a time to trust God. Or how about the parents that have raised these young people who are needing to go? You got to let me go. Was a very profound thing that when Kurt Mason, as we grieve with the Mason family, his death, when he moved out and bought his condo last year, and he said, "Mom, you got to let me go." And it's a hard thing when you're a parent and you've loved these kids, and so it's a time of trust to let a young person leave home in a world that's not safe. When you decide that you might want to get married, that's a time to trust. When you've heard a call to serve your country and you're enlisting. When you're taking a big risk in your career. When you're making the decision about whether or not to have surgery is a time of trust. All of these, what is it for you? When is trusting in God important to you? Can you present that to God today and have trust be prayed into your being? Well, Psalms of trust make it very clear, as I said, how dangerous and deadly life can be, but they're also prayed by people who have been there before and seen what it is to draw on the resources of God when they're facing something frightening. Remember, in our first week, I said the Psalms come to us for the next generation. They're written for the next generation that's coming up into this world and assuming positions of leadership. And the Psalms are written as, wisdom for their lives. And these words are written by those who have been there already. They have fallen off the horse, but by the grace of God, gotten back on. I think about a family. I've shared their story, at least part of their story, in other messages. That young man who was my son's best friend as they graduated from high school, and they got those tattoos together, best friends forever, and 6 months later, my son's best friend inexplicably fainted in the shower. This all-American swimmer, going to try out for the Olympics, for some inexplicable reason, fainted and hit his head and died at 19. And left behind his mom, his dad, and 5 siblings. And they had to cope with that. Thankfully, their faith in their church was a very strong resource for them. But it was 5 years later that same young man's mom, teaching school, and at the end of a teaching day had a headache. And you wonder how many times teachers must have headaches at the end of a long day. But this wasn't just any headache. And she went to the doctor, and they did some quick testing, and they said, you have an aneurysm. We have to do surgery immediately. And they did. And she was there for more than 6 weeks, but she did not recover. And she died. And now, 55 years old, not only did the family have to have let go of their 19-year-old son, but now their 55-year-old mom. And when I ran into their youngest of the 5 kids in the neighborhood where we live in River West, and I said, man, how are you doing? He looked at me, he said, this is not our first rodeo. And I thought, wow, for an 18-year-old to have resources of faith to be able to draw on is a beautiful thing. And this is what these Psalms were written by people who had been there and seen what it was like that God had been there for them in their time of trial and brought their feet out of the miry clay and set their feet on a rock. And now I know that I can trust you with my whole life, oh God. This is a psalm of trust. Now, there's something else really important that happens in the Psalms that I want to spend some time with you on, because it's a really kind of a striking thing in the Bible that we tend to go right past because we don't know what to do with it. In that lovely arrangement of the psalm that the worship team sang, it's an example of where this part of the Bible is not referred to because we don't know what to do with it. And it has to do with how many times in the Psalms enemies are referred to. There's a wonderful pastor who is first and foremost a pastor. You wouldn't realize that his heart and soul have been devoted to congregational ministry because he's written so many books. A guy named Eugene Peterson, who happened to write a rather valuable paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. I wonder how many of us love to read The Message. 16 million copies of his paraphrase of the Bible have been sold. And he says, mostly the Psalms talk about God, but if you counted up, the second reality that the Psalms refer to is enemies. Second only to God. And he says it's apparent that people who pray have a lot of enemies, and they spend a lot of time in their prayers dealing with them. Or at least they should know that that can be a very real part of our faith life to pray about the reality of enemies. In the psalm that we have, and we put it in your bulletin so you could see for yourself, this psalm refers not just to the Lord being our light and our salvation, of whom shall I fear, the Lord the stronghold of my life, whom shall I be afraid, but it says, it talks about the evildoers and the adversaries and the foes that encamp against me and those that rise up. These are real issues in the lives of people. It's quite striking. We know that King David wrote many of the Psalms. We also know that, he didn't sit down and write all 150, that there was a school of thought over some years that encapsulated the Psalms, but that David wrote many of them. And David was a head of state, right? King of Israel. And if we know anything about David's life, we know that it was filled with conflict with enemies. First of all, as the people of God were fighting with the surrounding ethnic groups and communities that had never really accepted that God sent Abraham into their land. And so they were constantly in conflict over whether this promised land would be safe for them from their enemies. But then David, in solidifying his role in the northern kingdom, in conflict with the southern tribes of Israel, and bringing them together. And then finally, David's conflicts, which are really troubling, with his own family. And the violent battles with his son. And, if we've ever had conflict in our family, take heart. If we've ever felt like our loved one is our enemy, take heart. The Psalms are written out of these realities. And yet they're not written sort of like, the prayers of the North and the South back in the Civil War, where the South would pray to God, destroy those heathens in the North who don't read their Bible and don't realize that slavery is ordained. And it's not the prayers of the North against the South who are praying that God would vanquish those Southern rebels who don't realize that for freedom Christ has set us free. It's not that kind of prayer. It's not the sort of prayer that is kind of championed in political circles oftentimes. It's been a really political week, hasn't it? And oftentimes when you're devoted to politics, and we should be, because God gave us politics as a way of helping people, but sometimes when we're devoted to a political point of view, we have enemies in those who disagree with us, and sometimes we just feel a lot of hate towards them. I think about, what is it now? About 24 people throwing their hat in the ring to run for president in this political season that's going to unfold in the next year and a half. And how many are going to need to vilify their enemy as being evil? And yet one of them is going to end up being in that seat of executive office, and then realizing what it is to need to trust. And so realize that these psalms of prayer regarding the enemy are different than that kind of hatred to destroy. They're prayers where the person that disagrees with us, even hating their point of view, where they are turned over to God, handed over to God, not fought with. Very much in the spirit of what Jesus said about enemies, that these psalm prayers produce a climate in a world of differences such as Jesus produced among his followers when Jesus said, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. these Psalms don't fight against the enemy. They turn them over to God and even bear the possibility that Jesus embodied, where an enemy could be learned from, become a colleague, even maybe a friend. What a world, huh? That the Psalms create instead of division. And so I encourage you to think about which enemy can you hand over to God today? I talked to somebody not so long ago, said, I don't hate very many people, but I hate that guy. And they were just livid for something that had happened. And maybe we felt that. But we see that when Psalms of trust are prayed into our being, our hearts are changed. We're made bigger and broader in a divisive world. And we realize that God's doing powerful and beautiful things in helping us become a community, a sacrament of dialogue for the world. Who can you hand over to God today? Do you recognize the trust that has been prayed into the being of our African American brothers and sisters at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston? How else, after their loved ones were slaughtered, could they turn their enemy over to God and forgive? Only because they were very clear that the hatred that they would naturally feel had the power not only to destroy their enemy, but the power to destroy their own soul. Hand it over to God. Be healed. Well, back at our house, you'll be glad to know we got our grandson started real early in getting his day off on the right foot. The last picture was about a few weeks ago. This one was over a year ago. If he can't read now, I guarantee you he couldn't read then. But he sees me reading the paper in the morning and gets lost in the cartoons. We got a little phrase that has become repeated as part of our family, and the phrase is, my bops has got me covered. That's the phrase. My bops has got me covered. I'm bops. I ran into our brother in Christ, Keith Pierce. Some of us remember Keith, a devoted member of this church for many years. And sometimes people, need to leave congregations when there's conflicts over issues like human sexuality and all those things. And I love Keith, and he and I are really good. But, thankfully we're able to be the church, even though we're not in the same congregation, with love and respect. He told me, we talked about grandkids, because Kristen, his eldest, is expecting a baby, and he's saying, I don't know what they're going to call me. Are they going to call me Grandpa? I said, well, all I can tell you is it's not going to be up to you. Jonah decided I'm Bops. So I said, well, your Bops has got you covered. Like when he gets up in the morning and he comes in the kitchen, I'm the first one who's up, and I'm eating my breakfast, and he says, I'm hungry. I says, don't worry, your Bops has got you covered. And I make him a little breakfast. And he's trying to get those boots on, and they just are so tight. And I say, come on over here, your Bops has got you covered. And I help him get them on. And he's tired of his dad insisting that he learn to tie those shoestrings. They're so hard. And so sometimes when his dad's not looking and he's supposed to be getting his shoes on, he runs over to me, climbs into my lap, looks up at my eyes and says, my Bops has got me covered. when psalms of trust are prayed into our being. From our earliest time, loved deeply in a godly people, we realize, come what may in this dangerous world, God has us covered. God carries us. God has us covered.